Glory. Have you ever experienced it? Do you want it? How far would you push yourself to taste it? If you were to taste it, would it be worth the sacrifices you made long after it had all disappeared? How do you define glory in sport? How we define glory is largely based on many mental constructions we have about it, and these mental constructions have a lot to do with how we've been influenced by the narratives and discursive elements of the discourses in sport. These discourses shape our perception about sport based on things like the era we live in, what social values are prominent in the culture, or which powerful entities have a stronger hand in this shaping of our perception. This is what our perception of glory in sport is all about. First, we will look at Tony Gerado's perception of discourse from his writing titled Discourse and Critical Theory. Then, while remembering his position, we will look at other examples of writings while hopefully being able to understand the framework from which they were written and, as Michel Foucault would inquire about, perhaps have better insight as to, quote, what was being said in what was being said. Writer John Frau comments on Foucault's writing to say that discourse is a type of verbal expression in speech or writing. It addresses what plays significant roles across culture in sport. Discursive frames are what allow meaningful explanation about sport by way of reason, which leads to conclusions. This is how we experience, order, and evaluate the world. Perhaps most importantly, discourse enables perception. How is it that we form these representations of discourse? Gerado recounts Ludwig Wittgenstein's proposal that they form out of our systematic logic, whereby a thing is defined in relation to something else. This is the cause for what Wittgenstein calls a language game. Still, as we have seen, even a game has systematic rules, and in relation to language, even language has rules which communicators must abide by. What is the goal in all of this? For Wittgenstein, it is to bring the usage of words out of the abstraction and back to their everyday usage. Wittgenstein sees four main issues about this goal. Techniques of reception do not guarantee accurate communication. There are many ways of interpreting through reading, listening, or hearing, for example. Mediums. The very thing we are interpreting is also a medium of interpretation of the world itself. We may talk about a book at length, but the book itself is an interpretation of the author's perception. The interpretation tells you more about the person rather than the thing. Ask someone how an apple tastes, and you will learn a great deal more of how capable that person is to describe its taste than the taste itself. Training shapes the interpreter. Finding meaning in things is a result of the filter that is created in the mind of every interpreter, because their training in whatever field has shaped their filter. How can we then use discourse to define or interpret the field of sport? Ben Anderson offers what he calls the cultural field as an imagined community. It is through a discourse that subjects people to identify with its own concepts or values and thereby acts as a glue that binds this community of sport together. This discourse shapes its participants' pleasures, interests, and aspirations. Sports discourse is further shaped by what Claude Lefort calls capitalized ideas. These ideas are embraced by the bourgeoisie, the powerful ruling class, and create a schism in the community. Either you stand for these ideals or you do not. These literally capitalized words are idealized and implemented in the culture of the sport. As some sports evolved and modernized into the late 19th century, other ideals imposed themselves, such as economic considerations. Now the discourse shifts to considering the interests of spectators and the media in efforts to accommodate their interests as well. A discourse is not static, though. It is produced, activated, and dispersed over historical periods as the culture ebbs and flows, while continuing to embody beliefs, rules, and dispositions at an everyday level. Foucault uses Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of genealogy to explain this. At large, sports discourse is really a study of how the field comes to know and articulate itself. Changes in the discourse over time reflect the interactions between sport and other cultural fields. This can be seen in the evolution of the manicuring and maintenance of the athlete's body as sport becomes professionalized and commercialized, and so, as Judith Butler describes, a circular process ensues where cultural fields produce athletes who see the world in terms of their performance within the field. It is here that illusio takes precedence, as Pierre Bourdieu describes, where one's understanding of the knowledge of a field determines how successful one is at incorporating that knowledge. We see the continued understanding and implementation of the habitus, too, as the principles and practices of what is preferable continue to be communicated interconnectedly in the realm of sport. We see this play out in the example of the progressively individualist and media-focused celebrations in modern sport, which are even specifically rehearsed compared to past-day celebrations which were more spontaneous and communalistically team-oriented in nature. The joy of celebration from victory seems to have shifted to a relief relating to fulfilling one's financial obligations. To summarize, we see that discursive contradictions have characterized sport, from starting as a form of play to now partially playing a role of being embraced as professionalized commercialism. Sport has evolved into a cultural form. Its institutionalization now marks clear roles, uniting some and dividing others. We will now look at different perceptions of a few different writers given their time and place in the vast discourse of sport. In fable and folklore, as early as the 6th century, we see how individual perception in discourse can skew a competitor's strategy, such as in Aesop's fable, The Hare and the Tortoise. The hare perceives he has time to rest before the slower tortoise finishes the race. The arrogance and poor calculation of the hare reminds us that victory is not necessarily imminent for the physically dominant. In poetry, Ernest Thayer's Casey at the Bat in the late 1800s shows the duality of attitude and some capitalized ideas in the discourse of baseball at the time. Casey waves and smiles to the crowd, calming them with his confidence and displaying a Christian charity. But when it's time for action, quote, defiance flashed in Casey's eye, a sneer curled Casey's lip. The spectator's hope is shattered like the air from Casey's bat as he fails to earn them and his team a victory. Thayer notes the entire community is affected by this game as, quote, there is no joy in Mudville, mighty Casey has struck out. As glory faded for Casey, Hausman reminds us that glory fades in other ways, like when a record is broken. In this case, all that remains for the former champion is the memory of their accomplishment. Glory fades, and so does the body. For the former champion, though, their memory of being hoisted high on the shoulders of fanatics will last. For Nicolas Guillen, the hurdles of victory are more obvious for the non-majority group. His poem of a black Cuban boxer reminds us of the exploitative nature at times in sport, even referencing the dark-skinned athlete as, quote, a brand new rubber monkey. for the bourgeoisie of America's popular Broadway street to be entertained by. Guillen's sharp poetry from the 1920s reminds us of the extra difficulties non-white and or non-American athletes have had during similar pursuits of glory in the United States, while simultaneously praising this boxer for his skill and progress. Similarly, but more recently, Wole Soyinka's Muhammad Ali at the ringside flashes with dichotomy. He notes the lavish fashion and sweet-smelling colognes of the onlookers as well as the brutal savageness of the boxers. Envisioning boxing as birthing and boxers as babes, he writes, quote, "One will leave the womb broken." If the boxers are the babes, the spectators are the parents, in control and more powerful. Yet Soyinka deifies the boxers too as godlike with their fists of lead, toned in fire, one like a phoenix and another like the night prince of the world of dreams. The discourse here has shifted to hold athletes high as gods. Still, as Muhammad Ali gazes upon the fight, we are reminded that even the glory of legends fades, but as Soyinka says, quote, "New questers feast on these mementos and reinvoke the spell." Why would someone agree to be exploited like this? For the narrator in Maya Angelou's Fightin' Was Natural, it was a, quote, "ticket to ride to the top of the hill." The top of the hill meant a better place, a new vision, new opportunity. But the trade-off here was the pain of boxing to escape already painful life circumstances. If perhaps we couldn't see how glory in sport could surpass the godlikeness that Soyinka described, we now see Angelou's point for some. Sport becomes salvation. Fred D'Aguiar compares the back and forth of the play of soccer to the back and forth of the sun through the sky. It begins a day or a game for the people on one side of the planet, and as it disappears for some, it lights a new day for others as a new game begins. Yet this tale is not a happy one for D'Aguiar. Perhaps he is referencing how the giant state and its big foot have such influence over the game because of, quote, "this oil-slicked planet." An inescapable future in sport under the thumb of black oil corporations is D'Aguiar's vision as he writes, quote, "Black for you means black for me for kingdom come." This poem by Virgil Suarez sees a now retired boxer, Kid Chocolate, reminiscing about the women and glory he enjoyed as a star athlete. His whirlwind of fame and glory was experienced as a full surrender of the moment, just as a child bicycling down a hill, mouth open and hands off the steering wheel, completely enraptured in the experience. For Suarez, the heyday of Kid Chocolate and the glory of it was all there was. In journalism, one of the earliest writings of American football by Grantland Rice in 1924 also imagines the superhuman-like ability of athletes, metaphorizing them as storms, machines, tigers, buffaloes, lightning, and thunder. And even, as the title suggests, apocalyptic overlords of biblical significance. Fresh on the minds of readers was World War I, and Rice's comparisons of sport to war no doubt landed coherently with its readers, as was part and parcel of the discourse at the time. Before the advent of simulcasting, readers of the New York Herald Tribune could vicariously experience Rice's descriptions of the great game as their own, as spectators sharing in the thrills and defeats of their hometown heroes' battles over the greater course of the game of war. Mario Vargas Llosa compares soccer in the 1980s to other capitalized ideas like legality, equality, and freedom. To him, soccer is freedom to play so long as one plays by the rules of the game. This freedom stirs passion in crowds, making them secretly envious of superstardom. Unlike the unfair and unjust world outside the game, soccer offers something rare, an opportunity to feel intensely in the safety of a world of harmony, law, and equality. Yosa addresses critics of sport who say we should concentrate on greater issues. He reminds that sport is a unique and important element of life. Its exciting and empty nature is its very appeal to the masses. Inside the games, creativity and freedom blossom even through the language of its players and spectators. David J. Leonard shows that even into the 21st century, the skin color of an athlete still determines how receptive spectators are to their sportsmanship or lack thereof. Racial double standards of trash talking have permeated even the Olympic Games as spectators and media agencies publicly permit similar behaviors from white athletes but chastise it from non-white athletes. Apparently, even as discourses change in sport, elements of them remain the same, too. In fiction, a story's title by Jorge Luis Borges captures the essence of all of this in paramount style. Esse est percipi, which is the philosophy of Irishman George Berkeley, essentially meaning to be is to be perceived. As we have seen from Sharato and from Borges's main character as he realizes the facade of the sporting world, the discourse of sport is formed out of the ever-changing perception of it. Its formation, too, is perceived by individuals which reflect their perception back onto the discourse, arranging it simultaneously. And how does this relate to glory? To exist in another's mind as a glorious athlete is perhaps a more glorious existence than the reality of it. In a memoir from Haruki Murakami, he is struck by the inspiration to write a book while reclining in the grass, watching baseball, sipping a beer, and watching the sky. Perhaps it was the atmosphere of the spontaneity of play in sport that was conducive to this inspiration. From writing, Murakami takes up running, eventually meeting a great retired runner, Toshihiko Siko. Murakami realizes that even those who have become great don't feel like pressing on every day. For Murakami, this puts master athletes on the same plane as novice ones. Sports discourse even permeates our imaginations, such as in the imagined tale of the character Superman. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster show how the perception of an athlete is embodied by its viewers. Here, Superman poses as struggling athlete Tommy Burke, and Burke, now from Superman's covert athletic prowess, exists as his team's perception of him. We have seen how sports discourse allows for discursive discussion about it, as well as how it has changed through time, adopting certain values and discarding others, or keeping some, albeit questionable or downright discriminatory ones. To be glorious in sport is to be perceived as such, given the current discourse, and, as the Latin phrase would have us believe, to be is to be perceived.